Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. My name is Zarar.
I'm Cheesy.
And we have a very special guest again today, Elisabeth Hendrickson, one of my favorite authors, one of the people who really changed the way I think about sort of exploratory testing or manual testing or testing in general. And we want to get into that. She's, of course, the author of the Explore It book, which came out in 2013, ages ago. But is still as relevant as ever today, even though so much has changed with AI and all these things. But that book remains kind of like on its own. And that's a testament to Elisabeth's work. So Elisabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So let's start off with the book. It's been 11 years. You talk a little bit about what initially prompted you to write that book. And are you sort of surprised or delighted by how relevant that book is today and how much influence it has had? Did you even think at the time of writing it that this would be its impact? So two-part question. One, what was going through your mind at the time when you decided to document this approach, such a simple and powerful approach? And second part, 11 years later, looking back, are you surprised, delighted? What would you have added to the book that you've learned since? Just talk a little bit about that seminal book.
Sure, you bet. So the book kind of made me write it. I mean, I took 3 runs at writing that book, and each time it was because I couldn't get it out of my head. The first time I actually had a contract with a different publishing house for a book called Bug Hunting. And it turns out that it was basically 3 good articles and then a bunch of fluff that was terrible. And so we mutually agreed that the project would not go forward. And the book that I ended up with was very different from the original book and fit much better on the pragmatic bookshelf. The second run was just a disaster that didn't go anywhere, and nobody's ever seen that draft, and nor should they. And the third one, I think I finally figured out how to express what I'd been doing the whole time. And this is why I couldn't get it out of my head, because I kept feeling like there are these things that I do that I know how to do that other people seem to be surprised about. And I don't know quite why they're surprised, but I should write down what I do. And that was how the final, what ultimately got published, how that came about. The book wouldn't let me go until I got it out of my brain. And then once it was out of my brain, it was like, I can let it go. And I almost immediately went to work for Pivotal and disappeared off the planet for basically 7 years and did no updates to the book whatsoever. And kind of came up for air and realized that, hey, it's still selling. I still get, nobody ever makes a huge amount of money off of books unless you're one of those huge bestsellers. And spoiler, books on exploratory testing don't become those kinds of, you find them in an airport bestsellers. But it still makes royalties. And so I get a nice little dinner-sized treat every now and again out of it. And I'm so grateful that people still buy it and find it relevant. I will confess that one of the things that I was aiming for was to make it not generic, but timeless. I worked really hard to try to make it timeless instead of like at the time that I was writing it in 2012, I could have gone hard at specific technologies that would have been popular then. And I decided to keep all of the specific technical details out of it, other than giving examples of things, but to really make it more about the analysis and thinking approaches. And so that was intentional. And I'm not going to say I'm surprised, but I will say I am super grateful that it turned out that it worked well, that the book remains relatively relevant. Wow, that sounded terrible. But hi. I think I answered all the parts of your multi-part question.
Yeah, I just have like one follow-up on it. You've described, I was listening to your talks, and I think you've described test-driven development, which is one of the XP practices we'll get into, as a design practice, not really a testing practice. And exploratory testing, you also define not a testing thing, but it's really a learning thing. But in both cases, kind of like the word testing gets bundled into it. What is it about testing in software that makes us sort of think of it as independent of actually building the software. We've always sort of framed it as it's a second step of a process. And I feel like the Agile community for years now has been trying to kind of shift testing left and make it part of the development process more and more. And all these techniques, the two that I talked about, kind of aim to do that. What is it about testing that people just can't seem to kind of grasp and think of it as part of like one activity rather than two independent sequential activities?
I'll be honest, I have no idea. It's been stunning to me since I came up in the industry in the started in the late 80s, but really kind of grew up in the industry in the mid 90s. And there was this whole movement then about quality needed to roll up to the quality VP so that you would have true independence. And it took me a little while because I was new in the industry. And so what did I know? I knew nothing, but I kind of went along with this. And it just seemed to me like, but this doesn't seem like it's working. How do you all not see that this does not seem like it's working? And years passed and it still didn't work because the farther the testing got from the development, the longer those feedback loops were, the worse the surprises were at the end. I ended up writing a paper about what I was seeing. In 2001, it came out, better testing, worse quality. I genuinely do not know why today, after so many years and so many case studies, there are still people who think that you can separate testing and development. They are integral parts of a whole. If you want to produce value, you have to be doing both all the way through.
Yeah. Cheesy?
Yes. So, Elisabeth, I have recommended your book to numerous developers over the year. And in fact, I think I may be the one who introduced it to Zarar whenever he and I worked together at a client some years ago. It has opened the eyes of so many developers. I just want to give you all of the credit for that. What a great book. What a great book. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, though, because you have some unique experience that I think our listeners would just find fascinating. So this podcast, typically we talk about continuous deployment, continuous delivery, deploying daily. We talk a lot about experimentation. We talk a lot about, what type of quality do we have to achieve in order to be able to, write some code and send it straight to production. So we talk about that quite a bit. In the industry, there is the industry is in general not where we are right now. So there's a lot of talk about things like SAFe and a lot of the scaling frameworks, and there's a lot of organizations trying to figure out how to standardize and how to bring about SAFe. I know you have talked a lot about XP at scale.
Yep.
Which I think is fascinating. And I would love to hear your thoughts. I've heard you speak about this, so I know what they're going to be, but I would love to hear your thoughts on, how do you take maybe more of a pure, true agile and scale that in an organization, or at least talk about your experience in that area.
Well, I do want to be super careful about using words like pure, true, agile.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ignore that instead of going at that.
Yeah.
I want to first of all say where I got this experience of doing XP at scale. I worked for Pivotal, which many people would know as because of Pivotal Tracker or Pivotal Labs. But in 2013, EMC owned Pivotal Labs at that point. EMC and VMware had a very tight financial relationship. They took a bunch of assets from their portfolios that didn't really fit strategically with the rest of what they were doing, shoved them all together, and created a giant spin out that was 1,200 people at birth and gave it the name Pivotal, inspired by Pivotal Labs, with the idea that the new company was going to have the kinds of characteristics of agility and tight feedback cycles that had come from Pivotal Labs and a bunch of other goodness that had come from Pivotal Labs. So that's why it was called Pivotal. It was very much coming from Pivotal Labs, and Pivotal Tracker was built by Pivotal Labs, but that was Pivotal. It was a very different company. There was no guarantee at the birth of Pivotal that XP would actually win as the dominant way of building software, because here's 1,200 people producing enterprise database products, and we had Cloud Foundry, a massive distributed system platform as a service, we had not yet produced software at this scale with the Pivotal Labs methodology. Pivotal Labs methodology had been applied to a whole lot of stuff, including things at scale, but not quite. This was a massive scale, and it was enterprise software. And so for the next 7 years, I worked for that company, and we applied XP genuinely at scale to enterprise shipping software. And we learned a lot in the process. But what we learned may not be generally applicable to the entire world. And so I would caution people from taking the experiences that I had and saying, oh, well, we could just copy and paste what they did. You're going to have to adapt it. Now, that said, some of the things that we ended up doing, the way we looked at management came straight out of Pivotal Labs. Your manager didn't tell you what to do, might not even be on your own team, your development manager, if you're a developer. When they were on their, whatever team they were working on, they were just another engineer, but they were your point of contact with the rest of the organization. They helped you navigate the organization. They represented you in a process we called allocations, which I'll end up probably talking about. And they were kind of a coach and advisor. They got feedback for you, and they helped you navigate your career in this organization that was fairly large. And so that role of manager doesn't tell you what to do, doesn't shape the backlog, doesn't delegate work to you. They are your people manager. That was part of the secret sauce, because then we treated the team as the agent of work. So the team, the product manager was part of the team. The product manager, the team lead, which we called anchor, and all of the people on the team, and it was a cross-functional team with all of the skills on it that were needed for whatever the work was that was being done. That team could then operate in a way that was very much not a hierarchy. It was very much a group of people coming together, collaboratively owning the work. And so then the next challenge in scaling is, okay, fine, you've got the team as the agent of work, but all of these teams have to somehow produce value together. How does that work? And that was a combination of things. But the rotation system that we used helped to build empathy and connection between the teams so that we didn't have a whole lot of toss it over the wall or conflict and competing priorities between teams. We were able to resolve those kinds of issues relatively quickly. And then for the much larger coordination for how do we actually end up with a release out the other end that all works together, we experimented with a bunch of stuff and ended up with a process where all of the teams owned their stuff up through the all the way to the end, really. But there was a release engineering team that owned the pipeline, not the tests. So the tests stayed with the team, but they owned the pipeline and the responsibility for standing up the system level testing environments. So at this point, I feel like I'm rambling. So I'm just going to stop, but I'm going to just come back to where did it come from? Pivotal. Primarily Cloud Foundry. We adapted it to other products where it looked a little bit different. And how did it work at all at scale? And the answer is the team is the agent of work. It's a mesh, not a hierarchy. And we found ways to have the lightest weight level overhead possible and still ship something that had cohesive value to the customer. Did that make any sense outside my own head?
Absolutely. And I want to build on that a little. And I saw your talk, Focus, Deliver, Learn, Repeat, where you sort of took a lot of agile concepts really and kind of made them into 4 different constructs. And I want to focus on the focus part, because in a lot of companies that you go to, people are often distracted, whether it's multiple projects, context switching, management priorities changing, not knowing the market, all these kind of things happen, and it results in a loss of focus. And it doesn't really matter how great your developers are, how talented they are. If you don't have focus, you're really not gonna do much. So could you talk a little bit about how XP practices build focus? Like, how do they actually help people get off to the right start? Because that's the first thing in your focus, deliver, learn. So what about XP is it that allows teams to focus and concentrate and deliver value and not get distracted?
100%. So let's start with just the day-to-day. You're doing test-driven development in a pair. If you are practicing XP, then those are two of the core practices, pairing and test-driven development. Those two practices work together so amazingly well to build focus, because anytime you start drifting, you've got your pair there to say, hang on, what problem were we trying to solve? Well, let's go look at the test that we wrote that we haven't yet made pass. Oh, we got into the weeds on refactoring a whole bunch of stuff that we don't like. Let's write a card for that or put it as a chore in the backlog, and we figure out how to prioritize that later. But now it's out of our heads. So we can stop going down that rabbit trail and come back to what is the simplest thing that we could possibly do to make this test pass. Or we made our test pass and we're now trying to make things green, but oh, look, we have just decided to completely reorganize a bunch of stuff. We can stop now. That is not on target for just make this little thing green. And so the focus in the micro level is built into XP. And I've had with managing a bunch of folks on Cloud Foundry in particular, it was fascinating to hear the number of folks who basically said, you know, I'm neurodivergent in some way. And all of the practices that we do on a daily basis enable my brain to just be here now and stay 100% focused instead of getting all basically distracted and running down bunny trails all over the place. It was really fascinating to hear the number of people who said that. So I think that just XP in general has a bunch of stuff built in that enables focus. But then we got to look at the next level up, which is, okay, but how do we make sure that we're not running down a whole bunch of rabbit trails with everything's in flight and nothing's done? Like if we were doing Kanban, how do we have that same feeling of limiting WIP? Which we didn't do formally as part of our practice, but our flavor of XP actually in some ways kind of looked like Kanban in the sense that we did have ways of seeing when we had started too many things and weren't finishing. And so that gets into backlog management and the discipline to finish things and get them into the done and to be accepted column before we picked up new things. And on the backlog management, that was a collaboration between the product manager and the team, but often represented by the anchor or the team lead to make sure that things were in very clear stack rank priority order. And we had the team discipline, the working agreement that we picked up from the top of the backlog. You didn't just go fish down until you found something that you liked or that was in your area of expertise. Mm-hmm. So that helped the team focus on delivering value. And then you got to look at the next level, the portfolio level of focus. Mm-hmm. And there, I'll be honest, we had our challenges, but we did find ways we used Pivotal Tracker, and we found ways with Pivotal Tracker to make initiatives, that initiative level, visible so that we could have that same kind of sense, like it was almost fractal of, okay, and we're going to limit the number of initiatives that are in flight, and we're going to stack rank the initiatives mm-hmm. so that we don't fish down until we find one we like, so that we're just pulling from the very top of that initiative level. And then teams that had to collaborate to get an initiative done all the way through would find ways to make sure that their backlogs were aligned with the initiative level priorities.
Elisabeth, you're doing such a great job of explaining. Every question I'm thinking of, you answer it before I get a chance to ask it. So,
Well, I'm really grateful to know that this all makes sense outside my head, because I'm...
So I do have one question. You said the release engineering was a separate team that owned the pipeline in this scenario. Did the teams have the latitude to kind of build out their own pipeline, or did the release engineering team kind of manage that and deliver that to the teams? And what was that relationship? So let's say that the three of us are on a team and there's maybe something we want to do in our pipeline that maybe other teams don't. How would that work out?
The way that we organize the tests, it wouldn't necessarily be a pipeline change. Like we The specific technologies that we use don't matter, so I'm just not going to bother naming them. But you had your unit tests that came out of TDD, and integration level tests also would probably, because we did a lot of in outside in TDD, and so we would also have integration level tests. We had very tiny, people who are only listening can't see how small the gap is that I'm holding in my fingers, but tiny number of end-to-end tests, just enough to be sure that things were wired up.
And it probably was still too many, by the way, but
I'll argue not in this case.
Okay, all right.
I will argue this is one of the very few cases that I've seen where we probably could have stood to have a few more end-to-end tests. Now, I should also say that I worked on Cloud Foundry from the end of 2012 to the end of 2014. And so it is certainly possible that by the time I left the company in 2019, the overall profile of tests had changed. But I'm thinking about circa 2014, we could have had a few more. It would have been. Anyway, I digress. I totally digress. The point is, you asked, could teams decide for themselves? They absolutely got to decide what tests ran, and teams could, I'm trying to remember exactly how the team environments worked. I believe, if I remember correctly, teams owned their own environments. And so when things kicked off in CI, all of their tests are running. And they also were all the unit and integration tests all would run locally as well. And then the pipeline really picked up from the point where the team had reason to believe that they were done with stuff. A team could decide to change things like exactly how do we do acceptance testing. The product manager did the acceptance tests, and my guidance when I was managing there was that at the time I was managing managers and overseeing chunks of the engineering side of things. And my guidance to teams was, your product manager needs to see evidence that they got what they asked for. How exactly they see that evidence, if you put it into the staging environment and they accept from the staging environment, fine. If you can genuinely demonstrate on your local machine, I'm not going to tell you can't do that. So they could make the team level working agreements around things like that. But when it came to the actual pipeline, because the pipeline really picked up at the point where the team was done, then no, they had to provide, they had to use the same standard test run command, so that in the pipeline, the release engineering team didn't have to think about, oh, right. This is the team that wants me to throw in that flag or run with that script that is different. They had to conform to a certain API.
Yeah, and I think that's where the industry sort of has headed now with basically NPM test or whatever mixed test is basically you build your commands behind that. So I do have a question. We talked a little bit about XP practices, and you mentioned pair programming, and TDD and pair programming are two practices that, if you're not familiar with them, you may have an initial allergic reaction to them just because you may not have worked that way before. And you quoted Dale Emery in a previous interview you did, and you something you said was, well, if somebody sort of resists it, you should treat resistance as a resource. So can you talk about some examples where you went with a team that was initially sort of resistant to these practices for whatever reason, and how you were able to move them to actually try it out? And I know we can always experiment with things, but sometimes you're in an organizational context which doesn't necessarily promote experimentation. And sometimes you have to sort of bottom up the experimentation rather than assume there's an environment conducive to that. Talk a little bit about how, as a coach you came in, or as a Scrum Master that listen to this podcast, maybe it's valuable for them, how you can sort of break down some of these walls of resistance that you first encounter for these XP practices.
Sure. I should also first say that from 2013 on for Cloud Foundry, we were explicitly making the pairing and TDD part of the interview process. And so nobody joined who didn't know what they were signing up for. We did have cases, though, where somebody basically said, yes, I'm on board. Never done it before, but I'm philosophically aligned. And then a few months in, they said, well, I'm having second thoughts. But that's not the essence of your question. Your question was more like, okay, you've got a team that's been working in some other way, and now you're trying to get them to work in more of an XP aligned way. And we did have cases of that with when I went over to the data side of things. We had Greenplum, Gemfire. These are enterprise data products. And those teams had historically worked in much more of an individual and in some cases, hero-driven kind of culture. And part of my mission was to get us more closely aligned. We didn't get to strict XP. It's really hard to get to strict XP when you have a code base that is over 10 years old and you can see like the architectural layers from the epochs of styles in code. It's really hard to get to a very strict, I write a test, etc. But you can get closer to that. And it did require convincing people. And resistance as a resource, let's just start with listening carefully and understanding why. If I said, hey, let's try thing that sounds great, like just wild to them. Thing that does not make any sense to this team. I mean, I had people on the data side saying, yeah, that's cute. And the things you want to do, that's cute. And that works fine for that web stuff, but we're a real enterprise product. We're a database. Doesn't work for us. You have to set of practices. Oh, okay. Tell me more. Right? Like that's the first thing is tell me more. And the resistance as a resource thing is, this is why Dale is just genius and frankly, a better person than I am. And I learned so much from him because he taught me how to approach those kinds of conversations with genuine curiosity so that I could learn the worldview that was leading them to the conclusions they held. And then I can engage with them in a real conversation that is not a top-down mandate and is not disingenuous, Socratic, whatever. It's just really genuine. Okay, I'm hearing you. I hear you say that you believe that the true testimony to an engineer's skill is their ability to drive a feature all the way through by themselves without collaborating with other people, because that shows that they're not doing their own work. So, this is a real conversation I had with somebody. And then I can challenge those questions. And I'll also say that if you're making a big shift, as we were, and I didn't know the end game, but I sure knew that it was going to look a lot different from the starting point. There are people who will opt out, and that is okay. So like the person I had that particular conversation with opted out because they could see where the writing was on the wall. They could see where things were going to go, and they left. But it still, having that conversation educated me so much about what they believed to be true about what XP is and where it's applicable. And that really helped with shifting their perspective.
Yeah, Cheesy, you have a question? Or?
Wow. First of all, we can continue this conversation for a few more hours, I'm sure. Continuing to dig in. So a lot of times whenever folks think about XP, they do go right straight to pair programming and test-driven development, and continuous integration and some of the great practices that have been brought to us by XP. There was a lot more to XP than just those coding practices, if you will. And so, I'm really interested because the coding practices, I think so many teams, they figure that out eventually. But where they have difficulty is more in the coordination. Maybe what you were talking to or referring to as initiatives earlier, around how do we whenever we have something in a larger organization that requires lots of teams to work together, and how can we do that in a lightweight way? And I know that's a question that I'm asked quite frequently. I'd love to hear your opinion, or at least how you guys solve that at Pivotal. How did you, at that initiative level, how did you coordinate that work to make sure all of the pieces and parts sort of came together at the end?
Totally. So first of all, I'm going to say that we ended up with some answers that worked reasonably well, but I am not here to sell you on the pivotal way TM, but instead share what we learned. So where we ended up was twofold. One was we wrote some custom tooling on top of Pivotal Tracker, which historically had been used for project level stuff, like team level, but not for multi-team initiative level stuff. That was not its strong point. So we wrote some custom tooling on top of that allowed us to use essentially tags to create visibility across teams to help us see what was the progress towards completion of a given initiative. That visibility was huge in helping with the coordination. The second thing was that we did build a technical program management practice that was not there with the clipboards and the checklists and the status meetings. Instead, I mean, there were check-ins, but the point of the check-in wasn't to be that ritual where everybody lies about how far they are and plays chicken and hopes that the other team is going to be later than they are. Like, it was not like that at all. Instead, the technical, y'all are laughing because you know you've seen this before, yes?
Yeah.
Lived it. Instead, what our technical program management group did, and huge shout out to Evan Willey, who led that function, they viewed themselves as more of an essential aspect of the feedback loops. And they were in the business of getting themselves out of the equation, but they would intercede where necessary to ensure that the feedback loops actually connected all the way through, that the circuit closed. And so they kept finding new ways to do that, which meant that they had the lightest possible touch. And whenever they would find an issue, they would just find a way to create a feedback loop that would allow the system to self-heal around that. And the end result was a very lightweight set, that and release engineering. The combination of those three things enabled us to deliver value with the lightest weight possible coordination layer.
I'll have one before we close off. So, whenever you scale, like one of the things, like if you're a small company with one team, it's sort of very easy to stay connected to the customer and what the customer wants because they're probably in the room or you can talk to them or there's a direct line. But as soon as you scale and you hire more product managers and more people, there's a natural distancing of the team from the customer just because there's more people around. What are some ways that sort of Scrum Masters or coaches even can look at maybe organizations where they're trying to scale and not lose that customer voice? Amazon probably has a pretty good, no matter what you may think of the company, but their 14 principles, they're really customer obsession is the one that they sort of obsess about. And I can see that why it's built into the foundation of the company. Can you share some techniques or ideas on how, when scaling, we retain the customer voice and not just become a feature factory? Because that's what the tendency is when we scale.
Totally. Feature factory is the tendency, frankly, even with very small organizations. So a few things I think are super important. We were building enterprise software, and let's just say that the sales team was not ecstatic about the idea of engineers being in the room with customers. Engineers have a tendency to tell it like they see it. I was going to say tell the truth, but it's not a truth lie situation. It's more a perspective. And so they didn't really want that perspective necessarily in the room with the customer. And so we did have a distance between the actual customer voice, but that was the role of the product managers. And the product managers, their job was to take the cacophony of conflicting demands and distill that into a vision forward. And the engineers honestly had to trust that the product managers were really good at their job. That didn't mean that the engineers never heard from customers or from customer proxies. One of the things that we did in data, I'm remembering a particular meeting where I invited in one of our sales engineers who walked through the customer use case that he was in the middle of implementing on site with the customer and talked to the whole engineering team about what the customer really valued, what they loved, how integral our product was to their overall architecture. And the engineers got a chance to ask a whole lot of questions about, like, well, do they use this feature or do they use this? And how do they think about this other thing where we're thinking about trade-offs? And it was really impactful. And so I think whatever way you can use to get that visibility into what customers value, and maybe it's a brown bag guest lunch made with like a panel of customers, or a video from a we would do these trade shows where we would have customers doing case studies up on stage, and we would watch the replays of those in engineering so that we could actually see, what do customers value about our products, what do they do with them, what value do they create now that they have access to this thing. So I do think that is essential to build that sort of general context awareness. But I don't think that it's always appropriate to have a direct conversation between the people writing the code and the people using it, depending on your context. I'm not opposed to it. I just think that you have to be super sensitive to the context, and there are times when that's not going to work. So at least getting the information radiating into the engineering team is essential.
So I know. So how do you prevent a product manager from, or not prevent, maybe is not the right word, but how do you make sure your product manager doesn't sneakily become your project manager, and they don't start managing the tasks and they because it's fine, the customer voice is through the PM, but in a lot of companies the PM sort of becomes the project manager in a way. They become a delivery manager. How do you as a coach or as a Scrum Master, how do you stay on top of that and make sure that slippage doesn't happen?
Start by not blaming them when it does. So I've seen it happen a lot, and I'm thinking about a couple different cases. In one case, we had a product manager who liked control. Let's be honest, like this came from inside the house for him. He liked control, and he wanted to see that the engineering team was doing what he said that they should do. And then honestly, I had to intervene from a leadership perspective and have one of those hard conversations. But sometimes the reason that it's happening is because there's a vacuum, and the project managery kinds of things somehow aren't happening. And maybe that's because the team doesn't have working agreements that they need to have about how they're coordinating between folks. And that's something that I would want to bring up in a retro to basically, not as a leader. I want to be super clear. If I'm on the team and I'm seeing this, I'm a coach or I'm another engineer on the team, but I'm seeing this evidence that the product manager is becoming the project manager, or maybe I am the product manager and I'm going, I'm having to project manage, right? Like, they don't like to do that either. They want to focus on the strategic stuff. Okay, except for the guy who wanted control, but that's a different case. Anyway, if I'm noticing it, I want to bring it up in the retro and talk about, I'm seeing a gap here. I'm seeing us fill it this way. I think that there's a better way. What do we need to do differently to make this feel better? And that's a conversation the team needs to have to find better working agreements so that nobody has to step into that, that very, I honestly think if XP is working well, you don't need somebody sitting there with the checklist of things and making sure that everybody did their part, because all of the transparency, collaboration, and feedback loops are going to take care of that for you.
You're on mute, Zorar.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to ask a question to end it off?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Yeah. As he said,
catch up with Elisabeth.
Yeah, we can probably go on for a very long time. But Elisabeth, thank you so much for enlightening us on some of these topics. Thank you for coming on relatively short notice, and thank you for accommodating Cheesy's lateness to this podcast.
No worries. It's such a pleasure to see you again, Cheesy. It's been so long.
Yes, it has been too long.
I'm so grateful to y'all for having me. I also want to plug my friend's newsletter. I will get it for the show notes. But Nat good heavens, I'm going to be so embarrassed when I have completely blank because I don't have their name in front of me. But Nat has an absolutely fabulous newsletter that talks about the way that we worked at Pivotal. And I just read a draft about how we did management in engineering at Pivotal that is absolutely fabulous. So anybody who's interested in these topics is going to love Nat's newsletter called Simpler Machines. And I will get you the actual URL for the show notes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elisabeth. Listener, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again soon enough. Goodbye.